He was woken before the stars finished setting, dressed by other men's hands, and forbidden from ever again eating a meal alone. He would spend his entire life being worshipped by millions of people who had never once heard him complain, doubt himself, or admit he was tired. Not because he never was, because the written record of his civilization made no space for that sentence to exist. For 3,000 years, a man held a job that no human being had ever designed for a human being to hold. And somehow, generation after generation, people were raised from birth specifically to do it. This is what that life actually looked like, hour by hour, according to the documents, the temple walls, and the palace records the Egyptians themselves left behind. Start with the name, because the name is where the strangeness begins. In English, we call him Pharaoh, but that word is not Egyptian, it is Greek, and it did not even refer to the man originally. In Egyptian, the word was per-aa, meaning great house, and it referred to the palace itself, the institution, the building. Only later did the term slide from describing the house to describing the man who lived in it, much the way people today might say the White House announced when they mean the president. The king himself was never casually addressed by a personal name. In conversation, he was His Majesty, or simply the Good God. But officially, formally, in the texts carved into eternity on temple walls, he carried 5 separate names, and this was not decoration. Each name placed him inside a different relationship with the universe. The Horus name identified him as the living incarnation of the falcon god who ruled the sky, and it was written inside a stylized palace facade called a serek, topped by the image of the falcon itself. The Nebti name, the two ladies' name, placed him under the joint, protection of the vulture goddess of Upper Egypt and the cobra goddess of Lower Egypt, binding him to both halves of the country at once. The golden Horus name spoke to his triumph, the eternal victory of order over chaos, gold being the flesh of the gods, incorruptible and undying. Then came the 2 names Egyptians actually used most often. Enclosed in the oval loop we call a cartouche, the throne name, usually built around Ra, the sun god, announced the moment he became king, and the birth name, the one his mother had given him, was prefixed with the title Son of Ra. 5 names, 5 different systems of belonging, all attached to one human body. When a person's official identity is split 5 ways before he has done a single thing to earn any of it, it tells you something about how his culture understood personhood itself. He was never simply one man. He was a junction where multiple cosmic offices intersected, and every one of those offices came with unpaid, non-negotiable duties. The day itself began in the dark, and this was not a metaphor for hardship, it was a literal fact of the job. Temples employed priests called hour watchers, specialists whose entire function was to track the stars through the night, standing on the roofs and pylons of the temple complex, waiting for specific constellations to reach specific points in the sky. When they did, that was the signal. Time to begin. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, the pharaoh had almost certainly already been washed, anointed with scented oils, and purified with incense smoke. What sounds to us like an elaborate hygiene routine was, in the Egyptian religious system, something closer to a decontamination procedure. The king was expected to move through sacred space constantly, and sacred space had rules about who could enter it and in what condition. A person who was ritually impure simply could not proceed into the places the king was required to go that day. So before anything else happened, his body had to be brought into a state, the theology, recognized as clean. Then came dressing, and dressing was its own performance of state power. The double crown combined the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, a union that had technically existed for centuries, but which Egyptian religious logic insisted needed reaffirming every single morning, as if the unity of the 2 lands might quietly dissolve overnight if nobody bothered to restate it. A cobra reared from his brow, invoking the protective violence of the goddess Wadjet, ready to spit fire at any enemy who threatened him. A false beard, woven and attached, connected him visually to the gods, who were depicted with beards even though living Egyptian men did not wear them. An oxtail hung from his belt. A crook and flail, symbols of shepherding and authority, sat ready in his hands. When he finally appeared in public, the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus recorded that he was carried on a palanquin hoisted on the shoulders of noble attendants with fan-bearers and flower carriers walking beside him so that the very air around the good god would be perfumed. This was not comfort. This was distance, engineered and constant, the deliberate separation of a body from the ordinary ground that ordinary people walked on. He did not begin his day asking what he needed to do. He began it asking who he was required to be in the next hour, and the answer changed constantly, depending on which god, which ritual, which audience was waiting. Understanding why any of this mattered requires understanding a single concept that sits underneath nearly everything the Egyptians ever wrote, built, or believed: Mat. There is no clean English translation. It gets rendered as truth, justice, order, balance, or the correct way of things, and honestly, it is all of those simultaneously. The goddess Mat was depicted with a single ostrich feather on her head, and in the judgment of the dead, a person's heart was weighed against that feather to determine whether they had lived rightly. When the Nile flooded on schedule, that was Mat functioning correctly. When the harvest came in on time, that was Mat. When the sun rose, when justice was served in a court dispute, when the state held together, all of it was Mat working as intended. But here is the detail that most popular retellings skip past, and it is the detail that actually explains the entire structure of the Pharaoh's day. Maat was never a finished state. It was not something you achieved once and then coasted on. It had to be actively regenerated every single day, through ritual, through correct behavior, through the ongoing labor of specific people performing specific acts. Chaos, the opposite of Maat, did not politely wait for someone to get around to holding it back. And the person officially responsible for holding it back, in the Egyptian worldview, was the king. This produced a genuinely uncomfortable logical consequence. If the man upholding cosmic order got sick, what did that say about the order itself? Egyptian texts frequently interpreted disastrous Nile floods, poor harvests, or military defeats as signs that something had gone wrong in the relationship between the king and the gods. He could not afford to appear weak, and this wasn't vanity, it was function. A visibly failing king implied a failing universe, and that implication had to be managed constantly, publicly, and convincingly. Hundreds of temples stood across Egypt, and inside the innermost sanctuary of each one lived a god in the form of a statue. And that statue had to be woken, washed, dressed, and fed every single morning, exactly as if it were a living person. Priests broke the clay seal on the doors of the naos, the shrine housing the statue, cleaned the image, dressed it in fresh linen, and set food before it, repeated up to 3 times a day. Obviously, one man could not physically travel to hundreds of temples spread across hundreds of miles of Egyptian territory every morning. But in the theology, this limitation was simply irrelevant. It was the king who performed every one of these rituals, and the priests carrying them out were understood as his substitutes, his instruments, acting with his authority and on his behalf. Walk through the surviving temple reliefs today, and you will not find priests depicted making offerings to the gods. You will find the king, always the king, holding the incense burner, presenting the food, standing face to face with the god as though he personally traveled to every shrine in the kingdom before breakfast. This is not artistic flattery. It reflects an actual legal and religious position. Ritual responsibility belonged to the crown regardless of who physically performed the act. If you're the person accountable for the order of the world in this system, you are accountable everywhere, all the time, whether or not your body happens to be present. It is either an extraordinarily elegant piece of political design or an unbearable weight to carry. Most likely, it was both, simultaneously, for an entire lifetime. There is a second image that repeats across Egyptian temple walls with almost eerie consistency, appearing in essentially unchanged form for roughly 3,000 years, from the earliest dynasties through the Ptolemaic period at the very end of independent Egyptian civilization. The king stands in profile, one fist wrapped in the hair of a cluster of defeated enemies, the other arm raised overhead holding a mace, frozen forever at the instant just before the blow lands. It is not a record of one specific battle. It is a ritual statement, repeated across centuries and dynasties, regardless of who actually sat on the throne. Chaos has been defeated, order has been restored. This is precisely why real military victories were recorded on temple walls as ritual acts rather than simple historical reporting. Carving a battlefield's success into stone did not just commemorate it, it welded that victory permanently into the structural fabric of the cosmos. Thutmose III, who campaigned 17 times over the course of his reign, had his conquests documented at Karnak in exhaustive, almost bureaucratic detail, down to the tribute lists. Ramesses II commemorated his second campaign, including the Battle of Kadesh, across multiple temple walls with a version of events that, modern historians note, was considerably more flattering to Ramesses than the surviving Hittite account of the same battle suggests. Victory belonged to the king by definition, regardless of which soldiers actually did the fighting and dying to secure it. And in the same relief scenes, you frequently find the pharaoh depicted standing beside the gods themselves, same scale, same posture, same register on the wall. And yet, and this distinction genuinely matters, he was not considered a god in the way Ra or Osiris were gods. He occupied a middle position, a mediator, neither fully divine nor merely human. A god has no obligation to prove anything on any particular morning to anyone. A mediator answers to someone. That distinction is arguably the entire emotional core of what it meant to be pharaoh. Absolute authority over people, combined with permanent, unrelenting accountability to forces he could never fully see or control. If all of this sounds abstract, mythological, disconnected from anything we could verify, one archive changes that completely. In 1887, local residents near the site of Akhenaten, the short-lived capital city built by the pharaoh Akhenaten, stumbled onto a cache of clay tablets and, not initially grasping what they had found, began quietly selling pieces of it into the antiquities market. What survived, and was eventually recovered, is now known as the Amarna letters, roughly 382 tablets of verbose diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian court and the rulers of other Bronze Age powers: Babylon, Assyria, the Hittite kingdom, and various vassal states across Canaan. They were written not in Egyptian, but in Akkadian cuneiform, the shared diplomatic language of the entire Eastern Mediterranean world at that time, roughly the Bronze Age equivalent of Latin. Through this archive, historians can read, in the actual words of the participants, what pharaohs were discussing with foreign kings. One Babylonian ruler wrote demanding literal proof that his sister, previously married off to the Egyptian king, was actually still alive before he would agree to send another daughter into the same arrangement. It is a strikingly human document, not a triumphal. Inscription, not religious poetry, just an anxious brother trying to confirm through diplomatic channels that his sister had not vanished inside a foreign palace. Vassal rulers writing from Canaan used an entirely different register. The ruler of Gezer, a city in what is now Israel, addressed the Egyptian king with language along these lines: "To my Lord, my God, my son, I prostrate myself 7 times and 7 times." Reading both sides of that same archive side by side, the diplomatic peer-to-peer letters and the groveling vassal correspondence, makes the actual social distance built into the system unmistakable in a way that no summary description quite captures. Beneath the ritual and the diplomacy sat an enormous, functioning bureaucracy, because someone had to run an agricultural empire stretching along 1,000 miles of river. The vizier, the highest official beneath the king, functioned simultaneously as chief justice and treasury minister. Beneath him, officials managed individual provinces, the granaries, the treasury, the army, and navy. All of it reported upward, and decisions that only the king was authorized to make, appointments, military campaigns, the allocation of resources between rival temple institutions, landed on his desk regardless of how minor or major they were. One of the largest recurring events on the religious calendar was the Opet festival, which could stretch across roughly 3 to 4 weeks. The cult statue of the god Amun was carried by boat from the Karnak temple complex to Luxor temple, a journey of a little over a mile along the river or the processional road, accompanied by musicians, priests, and enormous crowds. Inside the most restricted inner chamber of Luxor temple, in a ritual hidden from public view, Egyptian texts describe something happening to the king's life force, his ka, that renewed it and reaffirmed his right to rule. He emerged from that chamber in the terms that mattered to the Egyptian system, effectively recrowned. The crowds outside did not witness the ritual itself, only the procession, but that was the point. They saw confirmation. The world was intact. The king lived and the king was working. Health was treated with the same institutional seriousness as ritual, because a sick king was, as already noted, a theological problem as much as a medical one. Royal physicians existed as a distinct professional class, some specializing narrowly enough that Egyptian records mention titles resembling keeper of the royal bowels, or specialists dealing solely eye complaints alongside more general court doctors. Medical treatment in Egypt combined what we would now separate into 2 categories: empirical practice, setting bones, stitching wounds, treating infections, with substances that modern analysis has shown carried genuine antibacterial properties, and ritual practice, spoken incantations, protective amulets, appeals to healing deities such as Sekhmet or Serket, deployed alongside the physical treatment rather than instead of it. There was no contradiction felt between the 2 approaches. A wound could be stitched and also spoken over, and both actions were understood as necessary parts of the same cure. Food, too, moved through a controlled and formalized system. The king's meals were prepared under supervision, and while the popular image of a dedicated royal food taster is more associated with later courts elsewhere in the ancient world, Egyptian administrative texts do show that provisioning, preparation, and delivery of royal food passed through multiple accountable hands, part of a broader pattern in which almost nothing that touched the king's body happened without oversight, record-keeping, or ritual framing. Kingship itself required periodic, deliberate renewal beyond the daily rituals, and the clearest expression of this was the Sed festival, a jubilee traditionally associated with marking roughly 30 years of a king's rule, after which it could be repeated at shorter intervals. During the Sed festival, the king performed a ritual run, or series of movements between markers representing the boundaries of his kingdom, symbolically demonstrating that he remained physically capable of holding Egypt together, followed by a reenactment of his coronation, complete with the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt placed on his head a second time, sometimes several times over, in front of assembled officials and the statues of the gods. Some kings, Rameses II, among the best documented, celebrated an unusually high number of these jubilees over an exceptionally long reign, and depictions of said festivals appear on monuments from some of the very earliest dynasties onward, suggesting the underlying anxiety it addressed that legitimate rule needed to be periodically demonstrated rather than simply assumed to continue, was present from close to the beginning of Egyptian civilization and never fully went away. Around 1541 BCE, a purpose-built village went up in a narrow, rock-walled valley on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes. Its ancient name was Set Mat, the place of truth. Today, archaeologists call it Deir el-Medina. This was not a settlement of enslaved laborers. It housed skilled, salaried craftsmen, stonecutters, plasterers, painters, sculptors, and scribes, who were specifically employed to excavate and decorate the royal tombs cut into the nearby valley of the kings. The state supplied their housing, medical care, and water, carried in from the Nile by dedicated water carriers, and workers typically labored for 8 days at a stretch before receiving 2 days off. Because Deir el-Medina sat in a dry desert environment, an extraordinary volume of everyday writing survived there on pottery shards and papyrus scraps, letters, court records, absence logs, complaints about supervisors, giving historians an unusually intimate view of ordinary life in New Kingdom Egypt. And in year 29 of the reign of Rameses III, around 1157 BCE, when their grain rations arrived roughly 18 days late, the workers of Deir el-Medina put down their tools, walked out of the village, and staged what is now recognized as the earliest documented labor strike in recorded history. They marched to nearby mortuary temples and sat in, refusing to leave, reportedly chanting that they were hungry, until officials eventually resolved the dispute and released their overdue payment. It is worth sitting with the layered irony here. The pharaoh was, at that very moment, having eternity carved for himself in stone by exactly these workers. While those same workers were forced to physically demonstrate to extract rations, the state administration had failed to deliver on time. Both realities existed inside the same system, at the same moment, and both are equally real parts of what pharaonic Egypt actually was, not just the half we usually see on museum walls. Construction on the king's own tomb typically began on the very first day of his reign, and this was not a grim early omen, it was standard administrative planning. In the Egyptian framework, the transition from life into the afterlife demanded serious, careful preparation, the correct funerary texts on the walls, the correct objects placed inside, executed properly and in time. A portion of state resources was diverted toward this project every single day of a king's rule, for as long as that rule lasted. And there is a further layer to why the writing mattered so intensely. In Egyptian belief, a name was not merely a label attached to a person, it was understood as part of that person's actual being. As long as a name remained carved, visible, and spoken aloud, its owner continued to exist in some meaningful sense. Erase the name, and you erase the person permanently, retroactively from existence itself. That belief explains why successive pharaohs so methodically chiseled out the names of their predecessors and repurposed earlier monuments as their own, a practice best understood not as vanity, but as a genuinely existential competition for eternity. The best documented instance involves Thutmose III and his stepmother and predecessor, Hatshepsut. After her death, her name and image were systematically removed from dozens of monuments across Egypt, an act Egyptologists still actively debate, whether it reflected personal resentment, a calculated move to smooth over a disputed succession, or some mixture of both. Whatever the motive, the sheer scale and deliberateness of the erasure tells you exactly how seriously the civilization treated the connection between a name and a person's continued existence. It is tempting to imagine that behind closed palace doors, away from crowds and priests, the king could finally just be a man. The record does not really support that. His household was itself a structural component of the state. His principal wife held both a political role and a ritual one. His children, as potential heirs, existed as objects of constant, careful calculation regarding succession. Even in the most private quarters of the palace, a hierarchy governed who was permitted to enter, who was permitted to speak first, who had any claim to proximity to the king at all, because proximity itself functioned as a political resource, something to be granted, withheld, and fought over among courtiers. The king remained the king even inside his own bedroom. And this is genuinely one of the more unsettling gaps in the surviving record. There is no known Egyptian text in which a king speaks about himself purely as a private individual, no personal complaint, no expressed uncertainty about his role, nothing resembling, what do I actually want? Either such documents were never created in the first place, or they existed and simply did not survive 3,000 years of climate, looting, and time. It is genuinely impossible to know for certain which explanation is correct, and honestly, it may be unknowable. One period of Egyptian history stands out precisely because it shows what happens when a king tries to rewrite this entire framework rather than simply operate within it. Around 1353 BCE, Amenhotep IV took the throne, and within a few years, he had done something no pharaoh before him had attempted at this scale. He elevated a single solar disk, the Aten, above the traditional pantheon, changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning roughly effective for the Aten, and relocated the entire capital to a newly built city on virgin desert land, the same Akhenaten where the Amarna letters were later discovered. Temples to Amun were closed, their priesthood stripped of income and influence, and royal art itself changed dramatically, moving from the idealized, ageless bodies of earlier kings toward strange, elongated, almost androgynous depictions of the royal family, shown in unusually informal, affectionate scenes with their children. Whether this reflected genuine religious conviction, a calculated power grab against an increasingly wealthy priesthood of Amun, or some combination of both, remains genuinely debated among historians. And the honest answer is that we cannot fully reconstruct Akhenaten's private motivations from the evidence available. What is not debated is the outcome. Within a generation of his death, his son, born Tutankhaten, was renamed Tutankhamun, the capital was abandoned, the traditional gods were restored, and later king lists quietly omitted Akhenaten altogether, treating the entire episode as though it had not happened. The system, in other words, proved able to absorb even a direct challenge to its own theological foundations and simply route around it, which is itself a kind of evidence for how deeply Ma'at and the daily machinery built to sustain it was embedded in how Egypt understood itself. Egyptian civilization, as a continuous, recognizably unified culture, lasted roughly 3,000 years. More time separated the earliest pharaohs from the end of independent Egyptian rule than separates us today from Julius Caesar. The system does not survive that long purely through fear or coercion. It survives because it holds together internally, because the logic of it, however strange it looks from the outside, felt coherent and complete to the people living inside it. At the very center of that system stood a single man, whose job description left him no day, ever, that belonged only to himself. And there is no clear evidence he experienced this as imprisonment. He was not raised on philosophical texts about individual liberty. He had no comparative framework in which to measure his life against some alternative version of it. He was born into the role, shaped by it from infancy, and eventually died inside it. His position was, at once, the most privileged and the most constrained a human being could occupy in that world. And searching for tragedy in that combination somewhat misses the point, because tragedy requires the person involved to recognize what they are giving up, and nothing in the record suggests he ever framed his life in those terms at all. What remains, 3,000 years later, are the temple walls, the tomb paintings, the diplomatic tablets, the workers' strike records, the grain accounts, the erased and recarved names, each one a fragment of an ordinary morning that began in darkness and ended much the way it began, repeated across an almost unbroken chain of individual days, for 3 millennia by men who were never permitted to simply be men. If stories like this one, where the sweep of ancient history gets grounded in real documents, real inscriptions, and real archaeological evidence rather than vague legend, are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. And if there's a figure, a dynasty, or a hidden corner of the ancient world you want covered in this kind of depth, drop it in the comments below. This channel exists because of exactly those requests. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.